All right. Make your way forward if possible and grab a seat. Bring your snacks. Come on up. Let's squeeze in so we're not so far spread out. Some of you may not know that I met Mike many moons ago, 2008, when I came as a young seminary student trying to figure out what I believed on a host of topics. And I got to, I guess, be exposed to some of the things he's going to talk about really early on. I eventually became his teaching assistant. And I remember bringing lots and lots of books back from the library to his office on a regular basis. And, books that ultimately ended up going into the book that he released called Canon Revisited. And he was really smart because there was a class that he taught on canon. I think this was maybe summer of 2009. And Mike gave us as students a challenge that the person who found the most errors in the manuscript would get extra points. And so, we're all scouring the manuscript to find all these errors and mistakes. But I'll never forget kind of encountering that material for the first time and just being in awe of what God did in assembling his word and the confidence that it gave me subsequent to that, in an even greater degree to what I was reading really was from God. And so I just want to invite Mike up now and join me in welcoming him, and excited to hear what he has to say. Yep.
Well, great to see all of you here. Thanks for coming out, especially right after a long service. You were just in a service for an hour and change, and now you're sticking around. I said to someone as we started today, the only grace is you actually haven't eaten lunch yet, so maybe you're not going to completely fall asleep as we enter into this discussion time. But thank you, Jordan, for the introduction. I'd forgotten about me assigning my manuscript to the class to see if they could find errors and mistakes in it. Nothing like a little bribery to your seminary students to make that the cleanest manuscript I've ever had, so thank you so much for that. Well, thrilled to be with you, thrilled to be talking about this topic. This topic is exciting to me for a number of reasons as we kick off a little bit of time together. One is it's great to do it here. I look around and see a number of familiar faces, so this is fun. It's great to be at a church where I know so many people, and this is a fun topic to discuss with people I know so well. Another reason this is exciting for me is because this is the center of my research. This is what I've spent my whole academic career studying. As Jordan said, from the very beginning, I've been writing on this topic and have continued to write on this topic. In fact, I just got back from a 9-day stint, felt like 9 weeks, a 9-day stint in New York City, talking on subjects just like this, up there to a variety of groups. So it's always a joy for me to do it. But there's really a bigger reason why I think this subject matters, and I'm betting it's the reason most of you are here. And that is this question of whether the Bible can be trusted may be perhaps the most important question anyone can ever answer in their life. The reason is because the Bible makes so many monumental and grand claims about the person of Jesus, about eternity, about how we know God. And so whether the Bible is true or not isn't just a curious question. It's a monumental question. It's a life-changing question. Let me also mention, as we start into this tonight, that it is a massive question that we cannot even remotely cover in one talk. I remember when Jordan asked me to do this, I want you to defend the reliability of the Bible in one talk after church one Sunday. I'm like, yeah, like that's gonna happen. It reminds me of this comic strip that is my favorite comic strip for generations, which is Calvin and Hobbes. Some of you may have read Calvin and Hobbes growing up, but Calvin's this precocious 6-year-old with his friend Susie Durkins at school, and they get this grade back in their class, and Susie gets an A, and Calvin gets a C. And Calvin looks at Susie and goes, "I'd hate to be you." And she's like, "What do you mean? I got an A and you got a C." And he goes, "Yeah, I find life goes better when you keep people's expectations low." And that's kind of what we have to do here in this talk tonight, or this afternoon. What you realize is everybody comes in with questions, everybody wants answers to all their questions, and there's just no way to possibly do that in one session together. It's a big Bible with lots of books, 66 of them. Where do we start? Well, I've only got a few minutes with you, so here's what we're going to do in our time together. I want to start with the books that I think are most core to what we do. If Jesus is the center of the Bible, which is what we believe, the Gospels are the center of how we know about Jesus. And so if you're going to make any headway at all in this discussion of the reliability of the Bible, we've got to start with the Gospels. And I think if you can conclude that the Gospels are historically trustworthy, then everything sort of follows from there. It's a little bit of the first domino to fall. If you can trust the Gospels, you can trust what Jesus says. If you can trust what Jesus says, so many other things fall into place. So this whole world of biblical reliability in our time together, I'm going to shrink down to just whether we can trust the Gospels, not because I don't care about the rest of the Bible, because I think if you start there and we're successful there, so many other things fall in place. Okay, so that's our goal in our short time together today. And to kick us off, I want to start in a place you probably will not expect. And in fact, I want to kick us off in a way that might be surprising to you, because I want to start by talking about Muhammad Ali for a moment. And I know you're thinking to yourself, what in the world have I gotten into? Here we're talking about the Bible, and you want to talk about Muhammad Ali, the boxer? Actually, no, I don't want to talk about Muhammad Ali, the boxer. I want to talk about Muhammad Ali, the shepherd. Chances are you've never heard of him. But in 1945, in a little town called Nag Hammadi, Egypt, Muhammad Ali, the shepherd, maybe made one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the modern world. He was out digging in the ground one day with his brother, like a good shepherd would do. He's digging because he not only had sheep, but he had crops, and he was digging in the ground for a certain soil that would make good fertilizer. And as they dug in the ground, their shovel hit something hard, almost like something out of a movie. They began to push away the dirt and found there an earthenware jar. And they began to wonder what was inside. And certainly for poor shepherds in 1945 Egypt, they're thinking, wow, this could be our hope. Maybe it's buried treasure. Maybe it's jewels or gold or whatever it might be. And so they were about to crack it open when suddenly they started having a debate about whether there might be an evil genie inside that might curse them. So they had a big debate about evil genies and how they should weigh that against potential treasure. They finally said, well, it's worth the possible treasure. We'll crack it open and risk the evil genie. And they did, and they opened up this earthenware jar. And when they did, they were profoundly disappointed, because there was no gold, there was no jewels, no money, nothing that would change their lives meaningfully as shepherds. All that was inside were books. In fact, there was 13 books, 13 what we now call codices, leather-bound volumes, inside of which are about 52 smaller books, and they had no idea what they had found. In fact, Muhammad Ali sold it to an antiquities dealer who sold it to another antiquities dealer, and on down the road it went. If only he had known what he had found, because what he had discovered, and only later did scholars realize it, is what later became known as the Gnostic Gospels. What are the Gnostic Gospels? This collection of literature discovered by Muhammad Ali actually told stories of Jesus that, for the most part, we'd never heard before. We had no idea that they were even there. In fact, there were stories of Jesus that were radically different than the stories you and I know from the Gospels we cherish, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because if you read these Gnostic Gospels, you realize that the Jesus there isn't so much saying that he's divine, but rather that you and I can be divine. The Jesus there isn't saying so much that the problem is sin in our hearts, but the problem really is the lack of enlightenment. And what you realize in these books is that they are very different versions of Christianity than we've ever heard before. And at the center of this collection, known as the Gnostic Gospels, was one famous book that stood out. If only Muhammad Ali had known he had found it, he would become a very wealthy man. That book became known as the Gospel of Thomas. And I imagine many of you have heard of the Gospel of Thomas. Maybe some of you have even read the Gospel of Thomas. It's a story of Jesus outside our Bibles, and it's a story of Jesus that gives a very different definition of Christianity than we've ever heard before. Now, when you think about that discovery of Muhammad Ali, it completely changed the landscape of modern scholars. And people began to ask questions. And they're actually the same questions that you and I have, and probably a lot of you have as you're here this afternoon, which is, well, what do you do with a book like the Gospel of Thomas anyway? And for that matter, why are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in our Bibles? And are they even reliable? Are they any better than Thomas? Or do we have the right books? And who chose these books? And how was it put together? And why should I think that process was at all reliable? That is the fundamental question of biblical authority, and the fundamental question I want to answer today. Do we have any reason to think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John belong in our Bibles and not something like the Gospel of Thomas? Are they any better than any other gospels out there? Are there any more trustworthy than any other testimonies of Jesus that we have? That is what's going to occupy our time this afternoon. Now, before we get into that, though, and before I make my case, so to speak, for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and why I think those are the most reliable gospels, I want to pause for a moment. This is a really important pause because I don't think we can tackle this question without setting the appropriate context, why it so matters and why it's so influential in our culture. And so here's the question I want us to ponder for a moment, and that is simply this. Why do you think people are so fascinated with lost gospels? And by the way, they are. And if you've paid attention to the academic scene over the last number of years and even the popular scene, people just can't get enough of these so-called lost scriptures or lost gospels. If I sampled a title of publications over the last 20 years, you would hear things like lost scriptures, lost gospels, lost Christianity, secret books of the Bible, book kicked out of the Bible. And there's this whole sort of cultural fascination with this idea of lost gospels. In fact, if you want to do well in the publishing world, publish a book about lost gospels and you'll probably sell a lot of copies. And I know this because I don't write books about lost gospels. I write books on canonical gospels and they don't sell nearly as many copies. But if I thought to myself, wow, I really want to write a book that could sell a lot of copies, maybe I'd write a book on lost gospels and people would be absolutely fascinated by this. They're not really fascinated by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they are fascinated by something like the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Peter, or the Gospel of Philip, or the Gospel of Mary. But why? I think there's many reasons for that. One reason, of course, is we have a sort of inclination in our modern world towards sort of conspiracy theories. We love the idea that maybe something our world has believed for thousands of years has turned out to be wrong, and someone hid the truth from us, and only now do we really realize what the truth is. People love stories like that, so no doubt that's in play, a little bit of the conspiracy theory mindset of our modern world. But I think there's something else bigger in play in terms of why people are fascinated with lost gospels, and that is a general cultural conviction, a general cultural fascination with this idea of the diversity of religions and the diversity of philosophies. People absolutely are mesmerized by the fact that all over the world, all over the country, even all over the city of Charlotte, people have different ideas about religion and philosophy and truth and God, heaven, eternity, so on. They have a variety of opinions about all these things. There's a great amount of diversity of views about religious matters. Now, the fact of that diversity is not at all in dispute. Everybody recognizes we live in a very diverse world when it comes to religious convictions and philosophical ideas. But if you've been listening to the discussions in our world, you realize that it's interesting. People don't merely observe the existence of religious diversity, they actually draw a conclusion from it. And it's that conclusion, and it's that second step that no one ever notices. And actually, it happens so subtly, it's never even defended. So what is that second step? People observe the existence of all this religious diversity, and that second step, that conclusion they draw is simply this: therefore, no one view could possibly be right. No one religion, no one idea could possibly be right. They are all equally right, or they're all equally wrong, but they're all level on the same playing field. Don't privilege one religion, one idea over another. That is sort of in the matrix of our modern university world. And here's what you may not realize: it also has affected the way people study the Gospels. And when we discover Gospels like the Gospel of Thomas, scholars have begun to say, see, there's so many different Gospels out there. How could you ever know which Gospels are the right ones? How could you ever have any Gospel that's, quote, better or more true than another? And so what our world will tell you is that all Gospels are the same. They're all equally valuable or equally not valuable. There's no one Gospel better than another. So how did our Gospels end up in our Bibles then? Well, according to that scholarly narrative, they ended up in our Bibles because some committee, some council, somewhere picked those books and forced them on the church and banned every other books out there. But all these other groups had their own Gospels, and the only reason you read the Gospels that you read is because your group prevailed, your group won. If another group had won in the early Christian movement, you wouldn't be reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You'd be reading the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter. Now, that's exactly the thing that I want to ask today is it true that all Gospels are the same? That none are better than any others? That it's just an accident of history? It's just a randomness of history that gave us Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that we could have had other Gospels and it wouldn't make any difference at all? I want to push back against that. And actually, I want to say that that's actually not the case. I think that whole narrative sounds really good rhetorically, and I think our world loves to hear this idea that all gospels are the same, pick the one you prefer, and effectively pick the Jesus you prefer. But even though that works good rhetorically, it doesn't really work good historically. Because once you start looking at the data, once you start looking at the facts, once you start diving into the historical questions, you realize, wait a second, all gospels are not the same. And in fact, there's really good reasons why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John made it into our Bibles as opposed to something like the Gospel of Thomas. So here's what I want to do with you this afternoon. I want to actually give you my case for why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John belong in our Bibles. Okay, I'm going to give you the reason why all Gospels are not the same. I'm going to lay out 4 of these today, 4 reasons why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are distinctive from every other Gospel out there. I figured since Jordan had a 4-point message today, I should have a 4-point message today. So that is where we're going to be on common ground as we go. Okay, so here's my case. And as I work through these 4 reasons why our Gospels are distinctive, a couple thoughts on this. First of all, this is not to suggest there's only 4 reasons. Actually, there's so many reasons that I've written about in other places and that you can learn about in other ways. So this is just 4 of many reasons. The other thing to note here, as we make our way through these, is this isn't merely designed to convince you of the truth of these Gospels, but also for those who already might be convinced, to equip you. So that when you're asked a question about these Gospels, you can have an answer to the people who engage you. Your neighbor, your friend, sitting with someone on an airplane, and they ask you, well, what's so special about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? My goal is hopefully to give you some answers to that so you can answer those questions. By the way, I get a lot of conversations on airplanes. It's just the way, whenever you sit down on an airplane, what's the first thing? I just got off an airplane late last night. What was the first question people always ask you on an airplane? What do you do? And I'm like, oh no, here we go. And so as soon as I tell them what I do, I'm a Bible scholar, I'm a professor of New Testament, the next thing that usually is said is, well, I go to church sometimes, and they sort of then give me their confession booth life there on the plane. And I'm like, oh, you don't have to do all that, it's okay. But whenever you get in a conversation like that, it's great to have something in your repertoire to share with them. And so I hope that this will be part of that today. Okay, 4 things that set Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John apart. Let's start with the very first of these. It's simply this. Our Gospels, what we call the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the earliest Gospels we have. They are the earliest Gospels we have. Let me explain a little something to you about the way history works that you may not have reflected on much before. Whenever we ask the question of what someone was like, or what they did, or what they taught, we often forget that the only reason we know any of that in the ancient world is because somewhere someone wrote it down. It's just that simple. All of history is that way. Doesn't matter if you're talking about Christian history or Greco-Roman history, all history, the only reason we know about what someone said or did or their actions or their words is because someone wrote it down. Now, that doesn't mean we can't learn things from archaeology, which has some broad sort of parameters for what we can learn about history, but any particularities of history only come because someone wrote it down. So when historians are just busy looking at written texts, that's what we do. That's all that we do at one level is look at written texts and evaluate those written texts. And when we do that, there's something that all historians want. If a written text is purporting to record an historical event, you want that written text to have been written as close as possible to the historical event that it's purporting to record. In other words, you want that gap as short as possible between the event itself and the recording of that event. This is just common sense in the historical world. All else equal, if we have a document closer to that event, we have more assurances it's probably getting things accurate than if it was written much later, well after that event. Think about it for a moment. Let's imagine, for example, that we have a gospel, let's say, that was written in the 4th century, okay, 300 years plus after Jesus lived. By the way, we do have gospels written in the 4th century. If I had a gospel written in the 4th century, it's certainly possible it could have gotten some things right. It's certainly possible it could have access to information that goes back 300 years. But if I have a gospel in the 4th century and I'm comparing it to a gospel, let's say, in the 1st century, I have to weigh the fact that a 1st century gospel is written a lot closer to the events it's purporting to record. Now, when we take that principle and apply it to the Gospels, historians want to ask a simple question. If Jesus lived in the 1st century, and he said what he said in the 1st century and did his deeds in the 1st century, do we have any Gospels that date back to the 1st century? The very century in which Jesus lived? That's a pretty important question I think we might ask as historians. Do we have any gospels that actually go back to the century in which Jesus actually lived? Actually, we do. And actually, we have 4. And their names are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let me explain. One of the things that's remarkable about the dating of the Gospels in recent years is that scholars have settled on what is reasonably called a consensus about this. I can't tell you how many things scholars debate, but if you put 5 scholars in a room and ask them to debate something, you're going to hit 5 different answers on almost everything. What's stunning is that when it comes to the dates of the Gospels, that's not true. It's pretty much solidified now that across the board, critical scholars, secular scholars, conservative scholars, evangelical scholars all agree that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are dated to the 1st century, and, this is the key point, they're the only Gospels dated to the 1st century. We have no other Gospels anywhere that are dated from the century in which Jesus lived other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, the particular dates vary a little bit, so some will put Mark in the 60s, some will put Mark in the 70s, some will put Luke and Matthew in the 70s, some will put them in the 80s, and so on. So the particular sub-dates vary some depending on who you talk to, but the macro question is not in doubt. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the only Gospels that get us back to the century in which Jesus lived. That's a remarkable fact. In fact, it's so remarkable that it's often just overlooked. Now, think about it for a moment. If that's true, let me draw a few implications for you on that first point about the dating of the Gospels. If that's true, a couple things are noteworthy. First of all, just on the pure value of an historical document, if I'm choosing between a gospel in the 1st century and a gospel, let's say, in the 2nd or 3rd century, and all else is equal, I'm going with the gospel in the 1st century. That's already something that has a prima facie sense of reliability to it. But there's more that can be said beyond that. And this is often overlooked. If our Gospels are written in the 1st century, and they were, that means they were written at a time when there were people still alive that had seen these things. That means they were written at a time when people were still alive that had witnessed these things and could either confirm these things or deny these things. And by the way, that makes it very risky to publish a gospel if you're fabricating stories, if you're making things up. There's people around in that time period who can say, no, that's not what happened. That's not what took place. In fact, think about all the things that the Gospels claim that could be verified. So the Gospels claim, for example, that Joseph of Arimathea, a very famous member of the Sanhedrin, a very well-known figure in the ancient world, allowed Jesus to be buried in his own tomb that he had. Joseph of Arimathea is a well-known historical figure. Let's imagine you just made that name up and you publish it in the 1st century when people are around and go, what? There was no Joseph of Arimathea. I don't know who that is. Or imagine if you're Joseph of Arimathea and you didn't do that and your name appears in a gospel. You're like, I didn't do that. I never even met this guy. You wouldn't have any chance at all getting out of the gate in the 1st century if you wrote a gospel and there's people still alive that can confirm or deny it. I mean, imagine for a moment that you have a gospel from the 4th century and you made things up. Can a gospel in the 4th century, can anybody stand around in the 4th century and said, I was there, that's not what happened? No, because if you wrote in the 4th century, there's no one around to confirm or deny it. Now, of course, some people will say, oh, you don't understand. In the ancient world, people were so gullible. They believed anything. If you just wrote something down, they believed it. They didn't have a standard of what counted as good history in the ancient world. Not true. In fact, you may not realize it, but in the ancient world, we actually have a number of historians who write very specifically on what counts as good history and are very quick to criticize bad history when it's published. And one of the major reasons they criticize bad history when it's published is they say, you publish history and you didn't have any access to anybody who was actually there. This is something we see in Polybius, we see it in Herodotus before that, we see it in a number of ancient historians, all very willing to critique each other's histories for bad history. Make no mistake about it, you could not have gotten out of the gate in the 1st century making things up if you wrote when people were still alive. Now, think about this first point for a moment. At one level, we could sort of stop here. Like if I'm saying, if someone says all Gospels are the same, and I'm like, well, actually, no, only 4 Gospels get you into the century in which Jesus lived, you just need 1 point. When's the last time you ever heard a 1-point sermon? Jordan, any 1-point sermons recently? I could stop here. We could have a 1-point message today. Well, I'm not going to stop here, but we could. It's all you really need to know is that, well, you could just say, I'm no Bible scholar, but if you want to know something about Jesus, wouldn't you kind of want a gospel that was written in the century in which he actually lived? And we only have 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, but there's more. Let's move on to the second thing here that makes our Gospels different. Remember, we're making our case that our Gospels are distinctive from Gospels like the Gospel of Thomas, and here we come to a second reason, and that is simply this. Our Gospels, what we call the canonical Gospels, have a credible connection to the apostles. They have a credible connection to the apostles. Okay, now when you think about a book that you're looking at historically and about whether it can be trusted, the first question was sort of the when question. When was that book written and what's its proximity to the events it's recording? But now in the second point, if you're an historian and you're thinking about whether you can trust an historical document, you're going to ask a second question. This is what I call the who question. Who's the author? Who's writing this book? By the way, you think about this in your own life and probably don't even realize it. If you were to go into a Barnes & Noble and try to pick out a biography on a famous figure, you'd probably think very much about who that author is. You know, when it comes to famous figures, just about anyone can write a biography. And by the way, they do. If you were to go into a bookstore and look for a biography of individuals over time, maybe Princess Diana, who would be a very famous individual that tons of biographies have been written about, you could find just about any biography out there on any individual. But you're also smart enough to know that you're not just looking for any old author. You're looking for an author that actually maybe has access to the right information, maybe who was there for the events they're recording, and who was present to participate in the things that they're putting down on paper. So imagine, for example, you're trying to find a biography of, let's say, Nelson Mandela, and you're like, okay, I've got a choice here on the shelf between a biography of Nelson Mandela by somebody who was anonymous and someone who was his best friend. Not only is there a biography by his best friend, but you then discover that the best friend lived with him during many of these events and was there to watch these things unfold, actually sort of recorded them along the way. And then you realize as you look at the cover of this biography of Nelson Mandela, there's a little phrase at the top, and you've seen this in biographies, that says, authorized biography. Authorized biography, well, what's that? Well, that's a different kind of biography, right? Because anyone theoretically could just put pen to paper and write a biography. But an authorized biography implies that the subject of that biography has commissioned that person to tell their story. They've commissioned that person to tell their story and probably given them access to the information they need to effectively tell that story. By the way, if you are looking for that for Nelson Mandela, there's a guy who's done that. His name is Anthony Sampson, who's written the authorized biography of Mandela, and he was there. He was one of his best friends. He lived during the apartheid. He was there with the prison thing and then post-political career of Mandela and so on. Here's what you realize then is it's not just a when question, it's a who question. Who are these authors? We want someone who was there, who could see these things, who's theoretically the best friend, so to speak, of the person that we're talking about. Well, when it comes to Gospels, do we have anyone like that? Is there anybody that could fit the bill? And the answer is we do. If you read the New Testament, you realize that Jesus had an original group of followers called the 12. We call them the 12 or the disciples, or later they came to be known as the apostles. Why were they called apostles? Because they were sent out by Jesus to tell his story, and they were authorized to do it. In other words, Jesus didn't just send them out to tell it. He commissioned them to do it, gave them his authority to do it, so that when they told his story, they told it with his authority. So now what you have here with the apostles is effectively Jesus' authorized biographers. They were his best friends. They were his eyewitnesses. They were there, boots on the ground. We might ask the question, golly, it would be absolutely ideal if you want to know something about Jesus, wouldn't you want a gospel that could theoretically go back to one of those guys? That'd be amazing. We would be right there as close as possible to who Jesus is. Is there a gospel that can give you that? Yeah, there are, and there's 4 of them. They're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let me explain. One of the things that people ask me all the time is, well, these gospels are called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but how do we know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really wrote them? How do we know that the titles fit with their real authorship? Okay, that's a long discussion, and we can't fully unpack it in our short little session here, of course. But let me just give you one example, just to tell you how we know this as historians and why the evidence is really, really good that all 4 gospels go back to apostles in some way. Let's just take John as an example. John, of course, claims to be, in the early church understood to be, written by John the son of Zebedee, one of the 12. He's the one who laid his head on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. He was there from the very beginning. He walked with Jesus, saw the things from the very beginning. He was one of Jesus' very best friends. And we have a gospel that purports to be written by him. If you ask the question, well, how do I know John's written by him? Just because it says John doesn't mean it's actually written by John. True, just having the name doesn't in itself prove it. Although I would add the titles of those gospels go back very, very early. It's another discussion we could perhaps deal with at another time. But one of the ways we know whether these gospels were really written by the names attached to them is by testimony from the earliest Christians and whether they have access to this information. Let me give you an example of an early Christian, a church father that does this. In the 2nd century, we have a church father by the name of Irenaeus, okay, very famous church father. When he tells us very plainly that when you read the Gospel of John, you're reading the gospel written by John, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' best friends. Now, you might wonder, well, how do I know Irenaeus got that right? Where did he get his information from? Well, actually, we know this. He got it from his mentor, who was a guy named Polycarp, who was another famous church father. And then the next question that would be asked is, well, why should I think Polycarp got it right? Here's the amazing thing, is that Polycarp was mentored by John himself. Just think about this for a moment. John the apostle, the actual apostle, mentored Polycarp, who mentored Irenaeus, and Irenaeus tells us that John wrote John. He's only one person removed when he says that from John himself. Now, I can't tell you on a historical level how amazing such a testimony would be. We're like, wait a second. I got an early testimony from the 2nd century. He's only one person removed from the apostle who gives us reassurance that it's actually his book. That's actually remarkably tight in terms of historical evidence. Now, of course, a person could say, yeah, but Irenaeus could still be wrong. He could still be mistaken. Yeah, that's true. Irenaeus could still be wrong. He could be lying. Lots of things are possible. And certainly that's possible. But when we look at history, we don't actually ask what's possible. We ask what's probable. We ask what's likely. Is it likely that Irenaeus would have gotten that wrong? And by the way, that same process can be done for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. People often say, well, Mark's not an apostle. Why is that an apostolic gospel? Well, Mark actually, all the evidence suggests that he got his information directly from Peter. We have all kinds of independent corroboratory evidence that effectively Mark's gospel is from the apostle Peter himself and all his remembrances. So here's the thing, is that if you want a gospel that gets you back to Jesus' best friend, the only games in town are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. No other gospel has a claim to be written by an apostle. Why? Because all other gospels are 2nd century or later. That was our earlier point. If a gospel is written in the late 2nd century, no matter what name is attached to it, it has no credible link to an apostle because the apostles have been dead for over a century by the time it was written. This is why people always ask me, they're like, well, if the Gospel of Thomas wasn't written by Thomas, then why is it called the Gospel of Thomas? Remember, it's a late 2nd century gospel, the Gospel of Thomas. If the Gospel of Thomas wasn't written by Thomas, why is it called that? Well, just think about it for a moment. If you were trying to write a gospel in the 2nd century and get a hearing for it, what would you call it? You're not going to call it Bob's Gospel, right? You're going to call it something that has catch to it, something that has some sort of connection, something that has a famous name. By the way, I don't know if you have noticed, but almost every apocryphal gospel from the 2nd century all has famous names attached to them. Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary. We even have an apocryphal gospel that claims to be written by all 12 disciples at once, called the Gospel of the 12. It's almost like they're like, well, I can beat all you guys. I got a gospel written by all 12 of them. But none of these have a credible claim because none of them go back to the 1st century in which the apostles actually lived. Okay, let's look at a third thing here as we make our way through this list. So there's the when question. The earliest gospels we have are canonical gospels. The who question. These are only ones that go back to arguably Jesus' closest companions, his best friends, and therefore our eyewitness authoritative testimony. Here's the third thing that sets our gospels apart. Our gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, lack the legendary embellishments of later gospels. They lack the legendary embellishments of later gospels. This is actually one of my favorite observations that I'll share with you today because it really highlights how different our gospels are from every other gospel out there. One of the things people don't realize when they read our gospels is how they speak in such a restrained, matter-of-fact way. Now, I know that might not seem intuitive to some of you. You might think, well, any gospel that purports to share miracles doesn't seem restrained and matter-of-fact. Okay, fair enough. But the reason we don't realize how restrained and matter-of-fact is because we don't actually compare it to any other gospels out there. But when you do, you realize this. Let me give you an example. Have you ever noticed that when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that when it comes to the resurrection stories, have you ever noticed that you don't actually see Jesus rising from the dead? What I mean by that is that you don't have an eyewitness positioned there at the tomb to watch Jesus rise from the dead and walk out of the tomb. Instead, what you have in our gospels is that people show up at the tomb And he's already gone. He's already not there. The stone is rolled back, the tomb is empty, but there was no eyewitnesses actually there to watch Jesus rise from the dead. I can imagine if you were writing a gospel story and your clear crescendo in your story, the big moment in your story is the resurrection. Would you not, if you were fabricating an account, have positioned an eyewitness right there to watch it happen right when Jesus comes out of the tomb so you can sort of have it on videotape? Look, I was there. I saw Jesus rising from the dead. He walked out of the tomb and I saw him do it. But that's not what you have in the canonical Gospels. In fact, all you have is the women showing up and he's already gone. The tomb is already empty. The stone is already rolled away, almost like that's kind of what happened. But you realize that that type of restraint was not followed in later Gospels. If you want a gospel that shows you a videotape of Jesus rising from the dead, then I have one for you. It's called the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter is probably a gospel you haven't heard of or read. It's, again, a late 2nd century gospel, and it's not written by Peter because it's trying to get a hearing, which is why those names are attached. And it actually has essentially a videotape of Jesus rising from the dead. And not only is Jesus rising from the dead, and you can watch it, this gospel positions everybody to watch it. Now everybody's there to see it. So the Jewish leaders are there to see it, the Roman guards are there to see it, all the disciples are there to see it, and they're all waiting for Jesus to come out of the tomb, so they're there positioned perfectly right when Jesus comes out, almost like they're sitting around looking at their watch going, okay, Jesus, any moment now, and then he comes out and they see him rise from the dead. It's clearly an idealized account, but it doesn't stop there. When Jesus comes out of the tomb in the Gospel of Peter, he's not like the Jesus you remember, because this Jesus is a giant Jesus. He's a super tall Jesus. He's a Jesus whose head goes past the clouds in the sky. He's what I tell my students, he's Godzilla Jesus coming out of the tomb. And then not only is he different from the Jesus you remember, he's giant Jesus coming out of the tomb, but then as he emerges out of the tomb, following him out of the tomb is the cross itself. You're like, what? How did the cross get in the tomb? Usually in the Roman world, when they crucify people, they don't send them home with the cross. So how did the cross get in the tomb? And then the question is, well, how is it following him out of the tomb? Is the cross floating? Is it walking? We don't know. And then to cap it all off, the cross begins to talk. This is the Gospel of Peter. And you're like, wow, that is really crazy and really wild and nothing like our canonical Gospels. And you can see very much that it's filling in the gaps left by the canonical four. So all Gospels are the same, really? No. I'll give you another example of restraint in our canonical Gospels. You ever wondered what Jesus was like as a little kid? Remember what he was like as a child? It's always a curious question, right? When we read the canonical Gospels, we have Jesus' birth, and we have his public ministry at 30, and in between we have hardly nothing. In fact, we have a grand total of one story of Jesus' childhood in the Gospel of Luke, just one singular story. You might wonder, well, what was it like to grow up with Jesus? Did Jesus ever get in trouble? Did he ever get grounded? What did his siblings think of him? How often did his siblings hear the phrase, why can't you be more like your brother Jesus? We don't know what happened here when it comes to Jesus' childhood. But what you may not realize is that in the Greco-Roman world, when people wrote stories about famous individuals, the fabrication of childhood stories was rampant. People made up stories of famous individuals' childhood because of curiosity. What was Caesar like when he was a child? What was Alexander the Great like when he was a child? And they have these fanciful stories that talk about how wonderful they were even when they were children. The pressure to put those stories in would have been immense, and our Gospels have a grand total of one. And even the one it has is amazingly tame. By the way, if you want to know what Jesus was like as a child, I have a gospel for you. And it's a different gospel altogether than what we've discussed so far. It's called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas our friend Muhammad Ali found. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas tells you all the stories that you might wonder about as Jesus as a child. But I'm telling you, they are wild and weird and crazy. Jesus is a terror to his little village as a boy. There's a story here in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas where the little boy Jesus is bumped into by another boy, and he's mad and kills him on the spot. And then when the village gets mad at the little boy Jesus, he raises the kid from the dead. And then it gets so out of control that the village comes to Joseph and says, get your kid under control. And so Joseph goes to the childhood Jesus to try to rein him in, and the childhood Jesus threatens to kill Joseph. And then it goes on and on from there. We have stories of a little boy Jesus flying off of roof buildings and all kinds of crazy things. So if you want to know about the story of Jesus as a child, you can get it, but don't make any mistake about it. All gospels are not the same. Okay, this gets us to our fourth and final distinction. The last thing I'll mention here, and then I want to open it up for Q&A, and that's the fun part, to hear your questions and your reflections on what we've talked about this afternoon. Here's the fourth thing that sets our gospels apart, is that our gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were recognized as authoritative from a very early date. They are recognized as authoritative from a very early date. Perhaps we can ask the question differently. If we want to ask the question, which gospels should we trust? Which gospels should we read? Maybe we could ask the question this way: which gospels did the early Christians trust? Which gospels did they read? That's a pretty fair question. Now, by the way, most scholars will tell you, and this is the narrative you'll hear at major universities, that the early Christians didn't know what to read. That it was sort of a literary free-for-all. It was sort of the wild, wild west of gospels. Everybody had their own gospel, and they had their own canons and their own books, and there wasn't agreement on much of anything, and everyone had their own little stories they were reading. And it was only later, much later, probably 4th century, that any unity was achieved around these books. That's a good narrative. It's a good story. It's just absolutely inconsistent with everything we know about the early centuries of the church. In fact, everywhere we turn in the early centuries of the church, when you want to know what gospels Christians are reading, the answer is, well, 4. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Back to our friend Irenaeus. How many gospels was he reading and thinks we should read? He says 4 and only 4. In fact, he's so sure of the 4 that he links it to the 4 directions of the world and the 4 creatures around the throne. Irenaeus is seeing 4 is everywhere. The same thing is said in our earliest canonical list, the Muratorian fragment, 4 and only 4. Clement of Alexandria, 4 and only 4. Everywhere we turn, it's 4. Here's another thing you may not realize, is that in the 2nd century, we already have Christians combining gospels into one manuscript. So you have a single manuscript with multiple gospels in it. Now, if you put multiple gospels into a single manuscript, that means in your mind, at least, you think they belong together. So here's a question you might ask. Do we ever see canonical gospels and apocryphal gospels together mixed up in a single manuscript? Something like, say, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of Thomas in one manuscript? Absolutely never do we see that. Not once in all of Christendom ever do we ever see that. Whenever you have multiple gospels combined together in a manuscript, guess what? They're always Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So ingrained was this in the early church that if you were in the 2nd century and you were walking around interviewing people and you stuck a microphone in someone's face in the 2nd century and you said, hey, why'd you all pick Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? I'm not sure that question would make sense to people. They'd be like, I don't know what you mean, pick Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't see ourselves of having picked these books. I don't know that the early church even saw themselves as having the authority to pick these books. They were just the books that had been handed down to them, kind of had always been there. It'd be kind of like asking someone why they picked their parents. Ever ask someone that? Ever meet someone's parents and you say, well, these are a couple odd folks. Why'd you pick these two? Well, no, you're not going to say that, right? Because the person's like, what do you mean, why did I pick my parents? They kind of just were there as far back as I can remember. That's the way it was with the Gospels and the early church. From everywhere we can see in those early centuries, these were the 4 the Christians recognized. So any idea that people were widely using Thomas or Philip or Mary, that's absolutely not true historically. We know those Gospels existed, but our knowledge about them is that when people found out about them, they were widely condemned from the very start. Okay, 4 things that set our Gospels apart. Remember, our purpose here in this time together has been relatively simple. I'm asking the question of whether it's true that all Gospels are the same, that none are better than any other, that it could have been Thomas, it could have been Peter, it could have been Matthew, and it's just arbitrary accident of history. Well, as I said, that works good rhetorically. I'm not sure it works good historically. When you look at the historical evidence, which I just laid out, actually, and here's the big takeaway, it looks like these Gospels belong in our Bibles for a reason. Now, if that's true, one final thought for you, then that means that we can trust the words that Jesus says here, and we can trust the things that he does. And if you want to know why you can trust the Bible, this is why we started with the Gospels, because if we can know that Jesus said these things, then I can ask the question, what did Jesus think about the Bible? And the answer is he talked about it a lot. In his day, it was the Old Testament. He quoted it, he trusted it, he relied on it, he regarded it as historical, he regarded it as divinely inspired. And so you actually have a whole half of the canon right there that you can deduce from Jesus himself as trustworthy. You know what else Jesus did? And Jordan talked about this in his message today if you were here. Jesus also commissioned his apostles to go tell his story. And so if we have any other books by apostles, then we would know those are also trustworthy as something that we would regard as a scriptural book. So once you start with the Gospels, the dominoes start to fall. And you realize, wait, not only are the Gospels true, but if I believe that, then the Old Testament's true. And if I believe that, then I would trust the apostles, and I would think their books are true. And this is exactly why Christians believe the Bible is true, because you start with Jesus, and everything else falls and flows from there. Okay, time for Q&A. So I know you guys are absorbing a lot here, but just a few minutes here as we wrap up our time. I'd love to hear questions, comments, reflections you have, and this is your shot to fire away whatever's on your mind. Yeah, right here.
Yeah, in the first century, how many copies of the Bible were out? Because you said, hey, people could say, hey, I lived during this time. Did they actually have access to read this? Who had access to read it? And where all was it?
Yeah, so if you didn't hear the question is, in the first century when these Gospels were published, how widely were they circulated? Is that a fair way to say that? Actually, we have pretty good evidence for this because of the way those Gospels show influence on things. So we have good reason to think they were copied pretty regularly and spread around and well known, because other gospel writers show evidence of their partner gospel writers. So Luke shows evidence that he knows Mark. There's several books recently just released that show that John shows evidence that he knew Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So there seems to be some sort of cross-pollination of these books, even in the first century, which suggests they were widely known. Here's the other reason why we think they would have been spread pretty quickly, is because there was a really tight Christian network. When a Christian would publish these books, it would get spread pretty quickly. And we have evidence for that network that I could go into if you want, and I've written about it elsewhere. Here's one other final reason why we think those Gospels were spread pretty widely in the first century, is we actually have first century texts that look like they're quoting from them. Here's an example of 1 Timothy 5:18. Paul cites a passage there of scripture that comes from no other place but Luke 10:7. And you're like, was he just citing? And he calls it scripture. So is he citing Luke as scripture there? I've actually written on this, a full-length article on this, and I think there's really good evidence to think he's got the Gospel of Luke in front of him. So how widespread were they? Actually quite widespread in the early century. It's a great question. Yep.
Mike, could you talk a little bit about how, like it may be the case that these four Gospels are the earliest and that sort of thing. But I think some scholars would say, well, yeah, but we don't actually have the original autographs. And so we might be confident that these are documents that were circulated, but we don't have the original versions that these guys wrote. And maybe compare that to other historical documents that we kind of take as true.
Yeah, great question. If you didn't hear the question is, okay, let's imagine that a scholar concedes, okay, so let's say John wrote John, and I'll give that to you. John, the son of Zebedee, he wrote John's gospel, and he was an eyewitness. Okay, great. But do we have John? Because we don't really have access to what John wrote, so the argument goes, because John wrote in the first century, and all we have are copies of John, so maybe John's been corrupted and altered over time. Actually lectured on this yesterday in Greenwich Village when I was up doing my little New York tour up there on this exact question. And it's a really good question because people wonder, do I have confidence that the text hasn't been altered or changed? So first thing to realize about that question is that issue of textual transmission is not a distinctively Christian issue. Every document in antiquity is the same thing. If I want to know about the Roman historian Tacitus, I have the same thing. I have to ask how many copies I have and how early they go. If I want to know about the Jewish historian Josephus, same thing. What you may not realize, though, is the New Testament evidence is so much better than these other Greco-Roman sources by a mile. So, for example, if I want to know what Tacitus wrote in the first century, right around 100 AD, our earliest copy of Tacitus is about 900 AD. That's an 800-year gap between when he wrote and our earliest glimpse at his text. 800 years. By the way, that's pretty normal in the ancient world. That's not unusual. No one really bats an eye at it. How far back can we get a glimpse of the New Testament text? Answer, all the way back into the 2nd century. Remarkably early. In fact, numerous documents in the 2nd century give us a very substantive glimpse at the New Testament text. And when we see it, we see actually it's quite stable. In fact, one of the things I do at the seminary is I actually have my students read from one of our earliest copies of John called Papyrus 66, which is dated right at the end of the 2nd century. One of our earliest copies of John. It's almost a complete copy of John. You get almost the full text of John glimpsed remarkably early. Even has the prologue of John. And as we read through the prologue in Greek with my students, their reaction is the same every year, which is, wow, these are the exact same words we have now. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of the point, right? These have been remarkably transmitted over time, faithfully. So it's a great question, but I think we have a good position as Christians to be confident in the text we have. Other questions about these things? Yes?
For us to do further research, what literature would you suggest us to read to further understand the historical backing of Scripture?
Yeah, great question. So what further reading would you recommend for the historical backing of Scripture? Well, of course, there's lots of options there, right? But if you're talking about the Gospels, which we've talked about here, I believe you guys still have copies of Peter Williams' book in the back. Peter Williams is a Cambridge scholar, a good friend of mine, who wrote a very accessible, thin little volume called Can We Trust the Gospels? And he deals with a bunch of different things than I dealt with here. I think you could take a free copy on the way out, so I encourage you to do that. Another colleague of mine, a friend named Craig Blomberg, who's a New Testament scholar, has written a book called The Historical Reliability of the Gospels, and I'd recommend that as a deeper dive. One other thing to note for those of you who just want quick access to content on the authority of the Bible, I've got a website where I put out a lot of my content, videos, articles, snippets from my books, trying to give people access to this material quickly. So you can always look up my website. It's called Cannon Fodder. That's a pun, by the way, if you can't figure that out. And it's just look up my name in Cannon Fodder and you'll find that. So, yes?
This is kind of a loaded question, but I've heard a lot of...
Those are the best kinds.
I've heard a lot of questions regarding like the ideas of historical inconsistency within the Gospels and the idea of contradictions. Obviously, there's a lot of different aspects and examples that scholars like to find. Was wondering, kind of twofold question, like when did these questions and criticisms really start popping up? And then I know like there's probably no like catch-all for anything, but I would love to hear your thoughts on like quickly addressing that.
Yeah, great question. So the question, if you didn't hear it, was, well, what about contradictions among the Gospels, historical discrepancies between them? When did those start being noticed, and how do we handle them? Well, actually, this is one of the things that is one of the most common objections to the Gospels is like, well, they don't fit together. They contradict each other. If you've been paying attention over the last month, Bart Ehrman just released his most recent book called Love Thy Stranger. And, you know, he's one of the most sort of classic scholars who've claimed to find contradictions. And he was interviewed by Ross Douthat at the New York Times about his new book and brought up, again, a litany of his favorite contradictions. I did a response video for the Gospel Coalition on this that you can find online, where I'm interviewed by Sarah Sialstra, who's a journalist, and I give my reaction to Ehrman, and I cover some of these contradiction issues. And I've covered it in other places too. But the short order is almost all contradictions can be sort of resolved when you realize the difference in the way people did ancient history than in the modern day. We tend to think that when you do a story, you always have to tell it in chronological order, or you always have to quote verbatim. That's not the way ancient historians worked. Ancient historians would tell their stories thematically. They would expand narratives, shrink narratives, rearrange stories based on the way they link together by theme. They would paraphrase quotes, reword quotes. So the idea that you can say, well, this quote's a little different here than there, that's actually the way it normally worked in the ancient world. Now, we could get into particular contradictions. Ehrman's favorite is whether Jesus was crucified on the same day in the Synoptics versus John. I actually covered that in the video I just mentioned. So there's a lot of particularities. If you really want to deep dive into this, Ehrman's book, Jesus Interrupted, is all about his claims of contradictions, and I have a full-length review of Jesus Interrupted on my website. So you can go and click on that and read to your heart's content on apparent contradictions. By the way, one side note on apparent contradictions. Whenever someone says, hey, isn't it true that the Gospels contradict themselves? One of my classic questions I ask in return is often this. I was like, well, tell me which contradiction you've really studied and can't resolve, and maybe I can help you. And I think you might know what the answer is almost every time I ask that question, which is, well, I don't really have one, and I certainly haven't studied it. I'm like, but it's one thing to make a claim. It's another thing to have a reason for that claim. And I don't mind people asking the question, just like I heard this, but just because a person hears that, don't assume it's always the case, right? Study it, look into it, ask the hard questions. And so I always ask that question to figure out, what kind of person am I dealing with here? Are they really trying to resolve these things, or is it just a kind of a little bit of a, I just want to throw that out there and then leave it there and not really dive into it? So, yep.
What's the hardest question you get from people when you're out talking to them?
Thank you, Michael Richter, for that. Maybe that question is the hardest question I get. So if you didn't hear his question, what's the hardest question you get from people? Wow, that's really hard to know the answer to that. Here's
A hard one.
Yeah, so here's what I'll say. One of the things I've learned over the years as I've studied historical matters is the deeper I go, the more encouraged I am. And I think the more deeper other people go, the more encouraged they are. So what I've discovered over the years is actually the biggest hang up for people are not historical questions. Sometimes they're important as a deck clearing exercise. You want to get the historical questions out of the way so you can think that this is possible, okay? So I understand the role for historical questions, but most people's big hang-ups are not necessarily historical questions. What the biggest hang-up most people have, I think, goes back to why is there evil in the world? Why is the world in such a dark and broken place? And maybe even more to the point, why is there such brokenness in my own life if God is real? And so people ask me, explain that. And I'm like, well, not in one talk. Those are very hard things to answer. But what I often will say is that, yeah, the world is a dark and broken place. I actually, as a Christian, can explain why it's a dark and broken place, how you know it's dark and broken, and how God will fix that someday, how He will resolve that someday. And I'll often ask the question, hey, on your worldview, tell me, how is God going to fix all the evil in the world someday? How's it all going to be made right? How's it going to be redeemed? And what I quickly realized is a lot of people don't have an answer to that, or in their worldview, it never is redeemed. It's never fixed. It's never solved. And that's sad. And, I say, look, I get it, people have different worldviews, but if you want an answer to the problem of evil, Christianity, I think, has the best answer there. It doesn't solve everything, but I think it's got the best overall answer. Other questions? Yes, right here.
The question I get the most is all the different versions and interpretations. How can you trust the Bible, and which Bible do you trust?
Yeah, great question. So if you didn't hear the question is related to Bible translations. So there's lots of translations out there. How do I know which translation I should trust when I look at this shelf? By the way, we don't really have Christian bookstores anymore because they don't work for the most part financially. So you can't walk into a bookstore like you used to be able to do. But if you ever walked into a Christian bookstore and you looked in the Bible section, it's like, what am I looking at? Isn't there a lot of place where I can just get the Bible? Why do I got like 500 different versions of the Bible? And I get the concern there, right? You're like, well, which one of these can I trust? Actually, I don't think that the situation is near as dire as we think. One of the things that publishers have done is offered a wide variety of English translations, and a lot of them are really good. They have different translation philosophies, and we could talk about the particulars of the translation philosophies. Some are very wooden and literal, some are very dynamic and flowy, and you can imagine there's everything in between. And the reasons for that are obvious. Some people want a readable translation, some want a literal translation. I use the ESV most of the time, but that's a translation with its own philosophy, and there's others that do other things better. But my major encouragement for people is that I think we have unprecedented access to really good translations that before our generation, the world had never seen before. If you were to go back to the early generations of the church, a lot of people didn't even have the Bible in their language. And now we have it in all kinds of languages, including English, and these translations are, generally speaking, quite reliable. So I think we can take great confidence and comfort in that. Okay, I think I have time for maybe one more question or two. Actually, I'll see you two. I'll get one in the back and right here. Yep.
Simple question on the same topic of translation. With the names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Jesus himself, his name. When did or why did they change, kind of Englishify the names rather than keep the traditional names that they were given at birth?
Yeah, so the question was, why did the names of the gospel authors and Jesus have sort of English versions of them rather than trying to use the ancient historical way of saying their names? Actually, I don't think the answer to that is that complicated. I think that's probably just the nature of the way translations work, is that in the ancient world you have a name that has a certain cadence and sound in its original language, but when you change the language, you change the name. Like take Spanish, for example. I mean, if you wanted to know what Michael was in Spanish, it's Miguel. But if you want to meet me in English, if I imagine I grew up in a Spanish-speaking household and my name was Miguel, but if someone says to me in English, what's your name? I could say Miguel or I could say Ben Michael, and they would be interchangeable. But by the way, on that note, one of the things we do know about the names we see in the Gospels is that they actually are verifiably common names in that time period. We know these are real names that come from that time period. And Jesus was a popular name. You may not realize that Jesus is just the Greek version of Joshua. And this is a very common name in the ancient world. In fact, if you ever read the book of Hebrews, when it talks about Joshua, This is Hebrews chapter 4. That actually is the same name for Jesus, and your English translations are helping you out by calling it Joshua, not Jesus, which is interesting curiosity there. Okay, yeah, in the back. Oh, I'm sorry, you might have to speak up a little bit. Yep. Ah, very good. Yeah, you can't have a talk on the Bible without getting that question. So the question is, what about textual differences that you see in your Bible, such as the long ending of Mark? So if you've ever read through your New Testament Gospels, you see every now and then a passage bracketed off, and it says something like our earliest manuscripts don't have these words. There's only 2 places in the entire New Testament where that even comes up, and that's the long ending of Mark and the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman. So we're not talking about like this happening all the time. And I tell my students, look, there's a long story behind that, but we actually have quite a bit of confidence now that the long ending of Mark was a later addition, and so was the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman. And we can work our way back to what the original text says. I think that sometimes is upsetting to people because they're so used to those stories in their English Bibles, but the reason those stories are actually in their English Bibles has more to do with the King James Version than it has to do with the actual Greek manuscripts themselves. I wrote a full-length article on the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman and the long ending of Mark for an online magazine called Table Talk for Ligonier Ministries. So if you want to look it up, it's called Can I Trust the New Testament by my name, and I dive deeply into both those textual variations. Those are common questions, but they don't threaten the integrity of the New Testament because we can know they're not original. We can see that they're secondary additions. Okay, I saw a hand over here, maybe not. Okay, let me. Since I got you already, let me take this gentleman here. Yep.
What's your favorite book of the Bible and why?
Oh, I love it. We'll end on this question. What's your favorite book in the Bible and why? Thank you for the low-hanging fruit, my friend, here at the end. It's like, what's your favorite color, you know? So this is hard. I mean, you know, it's the old, if I'm stuck on a desert island, I can only take one book with me from the Bible. Which am I going to take? I mean, golly, who doesn't love Romans? Who doesn't love the Gospel of John? You know, Galatians, you could think about Revelation, Genesis, the Psalms for their spiritual encouragement. Since we're talking about the Gospels, I'm going to narrow that question down and say, what's your favorite Gospel? And my favorite Gospel, this is going to surprise you, my favorite Gospel is Mark. Mark is the underdog Gospel. I love it. Melissa and I actually are releasing a book next week, actually, a family devotional through the Gospel of Mark. And the reason that it ended up being Mark, so Melissa and I were having a little inter-family tug-of-war. Was it going to be John or Mark? And I actually ended up winning that debate, I guess. And maybe you'll read it and say it should have been John, but I don't know. But I love Mark. It's straight to the point. It's direct. It's short. Each story is self-contained, and it moves the narrative along really well. And it really emphasizes Jesus as the Son of God. Okay, our time is up. I will be here for questions up front when we're done. Thank you for coming out, and have a good one now. Thank you.